Stop before you click away. Listen to this. You think your family gatherings are tense. You think your drama is complicated. I promise you, nothing, absolutely nothing, compares to the sheer catastrophic bloodbath that erupted in 15th century England. A war so insane it was literally fought between two branches of the same royal family, all over a piece of gilded metal we call the crown.
For decades, the great houses of England believed they had achieved the impossible: stability. The dust had supposedly settled from previous generations of conflict. The great lords were fat on land and loyalty, and King Henry VI sat on the throne, a man born to wear the purple. But underneath that facade of gilded peace, a poison was brewing, an infection of ambition so potent it would rip the very tapestry of the nation to shreds and leave the fields soaked crimson.
Can you believe that the fate of an entire kingdom, the future of every man, woman, and child, from London to York, could hinge on the difference between a white rose and a red rose? It sounds like a child's game of colors, but this was no game. This was the Wars of the Roses, the most brutal, complicated, and utterly heartbreaking civil war in British history, where every victory was paid for in the currency of cousinly betrayal and unimaginable carnage. The fuse was lit, not by a foreign invader, not by an economic collapse, but by the king himself. Henry VI was pious, gentle, scholarly, and utterly, tragically useless. He was not a warrior. He was not a diplomat. He was not even truly present. He suffered from bouts of profound, terrifying mental illness, periods where the King of England literally did not know who or where he was, often lapsing into months-long catatonia. Imagine that staggering vulnerability. The highest authority in the land was a ghost, wandering the halls of Westminster, while the most ambitious, power-hungry wolves in the kingdom gathered their armies outside the gates, sniffing the air for weakness. And those wolves had a leader, a man whose very name spells doom for stability. Enter Richard, Duke of York, a man whose lineage was arguably stronger than the king's, whose mind was certainly sharper, and whose patience had evaporated entirely. York didn't just think he should be king, he knew it, deep in his bones, fueled by generations of sidelined ambition. He looked at the gentle, vacant Henry. He looked at the ferocious, manipulative Queen Margaret of Anjou, who we will get to later because she is a story unto herself. And he saw a kingdom ripe for the taking, demanding a strong, decisive hand. A catastrophe no one saw coming. Nonsense. Everyone saw it coming. They just didn't realize how spectacular the ensuing explosion would be. It wasn't a slow burn. It was a sudden, violent combustion of ancient grudges and newfound greed. The moment York officially declared himself protector of the realm, a move that sounds helpful, but was really just a velvet glove over an iron fist designed to seize control. The die was cast for total war. This was the moment England crossed the event horizon. This wasn't about Parliament or taxes. This was about bloodlines and who had the purest, most divine claim to the legacy of Edward III. The Lancastrians, symbolized by the red rose, fought for the established, if failed, king, clinging desperately to tradition. The Yorkists, wielding the deadly white rose, fought for the promise of a strong new dynasty, ready to remake the country in their own image.
The year is 1455. The location, St. Albans, a small market town about 20 miles north of London, which was about to become the site of the first horrific flashpoint in a conflict that would define the next 3 decades of English life, marking it with unparalleled horror.
The king's army, hastily assembled by his worried advisors, was slow and complacent. They moved like a disorganized parade, totally underestimating the speed and desperation of Richard of York and his 2 most lethal allies, the Earl of Salisbury, and most importantly, the man who would soon earn the chilling title of the Kingmaker, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. Warwick was arguably the richest, most influential, and undeniably the most dangerous man in England. He controlled vast armies and held enormous political sway. When Warwick decided you were king, you were king. When he decided you were deposed, you were history, swept into the dustbin of forgotten royalty. And at St. Albans, Warwick was firmly, aggressively, on the side of the White Rose. Imagine the raw tension. 2 small armies, maybe only 3,000 men total, facing each other in the early morning fog. But these weren't untrained peasants with pitchforks. These were heavily armored knights, men trained since boyhood specifically for war, wielding long swords and poleaxes designed not just to wound, but to utterly decapitate and destroy. The air was thick with palpable dread, the silence before the storm broken only by the nervous clanking of plate armor and of fluttering banners. Red Rose of Lancaster against White Rose of York, poised to rip the national fabric in 2. Henry VI, the pathetic figurehead, trapped in this nightmare, tried fruitlessly to negotiate. He truly believed that if he just spoke nicely enough, his cousin York would lay down his arms and go home, like a simple misunderstanding between gentlemen. York's response was chillingly direct, a masterclass in political brutality. He demanded the immediate surrender of the king's chief advisors, the men who had been running the country while Henry was lost in his own mind. These advisors were the hated Duke of Somerset, the powerful Earl of Northumberland, and Lord Clifford. Henry, weak in almost every other respect, but oddly stubborn when it came to his few loyal friends, refused to give them up. And that refusal was the starting pistol for 32 years of intermittent, horrific, and devastating civil war that would consume every great house in the land. The battle itself was a swift, brutal, surgical strike, a lightning-fast demonstration of Yorkist ferocity. Warwick, showing the tactical genius that would make him feared throughout Europe, didn't bother wasting time assaulting the main barricades the Lancastrians had thrown up. He led a massive surprise attack through the undefended gardens and back alleys of the town, smashing directly into the king's unsuspecting rear guard with poleaxes flashing. It was less a battle and more a swift, targeted massacre of the Lancastrian leadership. Within mere hours, the Red Rose standard had fallen, and the true, sickening cost of York's ambition was terrifyingly tallied. The Duke of Somerset, the very man York hated most, was killed fleeing the battlefield, his body stripped and abandoned. Northumberland was dead. Clifford was dead. The entire power structure supporting King Henry VI was instantly, ruthlessly decapitated, erasing his ability to govern in one bloody afternoon. And where was the king during this terrifying slaughter? He was found later, hiding alone in a tanner shop, utterly overwhelmed, mentally paralyzed by the sheer violence he had unwittingly unleashed upon his own kingdom. Richard of York, covered in the dust of battle and triumphant, marched into St. Albans and took the crown, not yet as king, not officially, but as the undisputed, terrifying master of England. This wasn't just a political shift. It was a psychological trauma for the entire nation. The unthinkable had happened. Noble blood had spilled noble blood on English soil, and the crown was stained forever. Get ready, because the greatest story of medieval betrayal is just beginning. This is part 1, the Rose Catastrophe. The smoke hadn't even cleared from the wretched streets of St. Albans, but the horror was already set in stone. 3 of the most powerful men in England, Lancastrian titans like the Duke of Somerset, the Earl of Northumberland, and Lord Clifford, lay dead in the narrow alleyways, butchered not by foreign enemies, but by the White Rose of York. This wasn't a skirmish. It was an assassination, veiled as a battle. And Richard of York knew exactly what he was doing, eliminating the king's closest friends to clear his own path to glory. The true tragedy, however, lay with the man who wore the crown. King Henry VI, the supposed ultimate authority, was found weeping, huddled in a weaver's shop, utterly incapable of grasping the betrayal that had just shattered his kingdom. He was a ghost wearing a crown, a monarch whose mind was as fragile as glass, utterly useless in the face of the carnage he had unwittingly unleashed. This catastrophic state of the king provided Richard of York with the golden ticket he had been waiting for. York hadn't seized the throne outright. That would have been too crude, too easily labeled as treason. Instead, he approached the trembling, traumatized king and knelt, offering a sick, twisted form of loyalty, forcing Henry to accept his protection. Within months, using the leverage of the king's total mental collapse, York maneuvered himself back into the ultimate position of control, Lord Protector of the realm. This was the ultimate political chess move, a move of terrifying genius. York controlled the government, the treasury, the courts, and the king's very person, all under the guise of stabilizing a mad ruler and saving England from itself. He was the uncrowned king, ruling with devastating efficiency, issuing proclamations and seizing assets, while the true sovereign mumbled prayers and slid deeper into his catatonic fog. He controlled the destiny of England without ever having to face the messy business of a coronation. But every action creates a reaction, and the most dangerous reaction was brewing far away from London's gilded cages, nurtured by a woman whose fury could melt steel and whose ambition was boundless. Meet Margaret of Anjou, the true power behind the Red Rose, and the person who would become the most formidable antagonist of the entire war. She was not English, she was French, and she was fierce, possessing the ambition Henry VI completely lacked. She saw York's protectorate not as stability, but as a death sentence for her beloved son, Prince Edward, the rightful heir. This queen was a political genius and a terrifying mother lion protecting her cub. While York cleaned house in Westminster, purging Lancastrians and rewarding his Neville allies, Margaret gathered the surviving nobility loyal to her husband and son in the impenetrable northern territories. She whispered promises of vengeance and loyalty to the true line of succession. She was building an army out of pure, concentrated hatred. Every noble whose father, uncle, or brother died at St. Albans, the ruthless Clifford family, the enraged Percy clan, pledged their banners to her cause, swearing an oath that they would wipe the Yorkist white from the face of England. The truce York had imposed was a lie. The peace was a phantom. For 4 years, England breathed shallowly. This was the terrifying Cold War phase of the conflict, fought with spies, double-crossing letters, and calculated insults rather than swords. The court was a viper pit, split cleanly between those who served the incapacitated king but obeyed York's every command, and those who secretly communicated with the vengeful queen. York used his power to systematically undo everything the Lancastrians had established, seizing land and punishing loyalists, effectively ensuring that the wounds opened at St. Albans would never, ever heal. He was carving a chasm between the two families so wide that only total victory could bridge it, a victory that meant annihilation for the loser. But Margaret understood the slow, burning game better than York thought. She used this time not for immediate impulsive confrontation, but for strategic preparation. She ensured her son, the young Prince Edward, was recognized everywhere she went as the legitimate future king, solidifying her moral and dynastic argument against York's obvious self-interest. She was effectively running a shadow government from the north, isolating herself from London's politics and preparing for the inevitable clash. The north became the Red Rose's fortress, an area deeply suspicious of the power-hungry London court and intensely loyal to the old ways, and more importantly, loyal to the Queen, who promised them justice. The breaking point came not from York's aggressive policies, but from the Queen's calculated audacity. She absolutely refused to return to London, turning the traditional royal itinerary into a declaration of rebellion and independence. She was raising funds, stockpiling weapons, and making it devastatingly clear. The Game of Thrones was about to resume, but this time, the stakes involved outright regicide and total war. The nobles of the north were preparing their levies. They knew that the man who slew their kin at St. Albans would not rest until they were all eliminated. Honor demanded blood, and Margaret was happy to supply the opportunity. The uneasy 4-year truce dissolved into suspicion, and the tension became unbearable. In 1459, Margaret made her final, explosive move. Without consulting Parliament or the Protector, she summoned her followers to arms, effectively restarting the engines of civil war and unleashing the hounds of conflict upon the realm. This was not merely about governance anymore. It was about the annihilation of the opposing bloodline. The red rose was blooming again, and this time it was dripping with vengeance, signaling the end of the fragile peace and the beginning of the true nightmare. The dust of St. Albans settled, but the silence that followed was heavy with the weight of spilled royal blood. Richard of York stood victorious, a dark silhouette against the backdrop of shattered Lancastrian power. But his triumph was hollow, a declaration of war painted in the crimson hue of the Duke of Somerset's lifeblood. The King, Henry VI, was now nothing more than a prisoner, a bewildered, semi-catatonic puppet dangling from the strings held by the merciless White Rose faction. But to think the Lancastrians were defeated was the gravest of historical delusions. They had lost their generals, but in their place they possessed their ultimate, terrifying weapon, Queen Margaret of Anjou. A storm brewed in the northern counties, a terrifying, calculating fury that made the previous court squabbles look like children's games. Margaret was no longer merely a queen. She was a wounded lioness whose heir, Prince Edward, was now directly threatened by the usurper York. She would never, could never, forgive the man who had dared lay violent hands upon her husband and systematically destroyed her loyal inner circle. This was not politics anymore. This was deeply personal, a blood feud demanding total, irreversible annihilation. Richard, Duke of York, now held the terrified capital, London, paralyzed by fear and opportunistic ambition. He moved with swift, calculated cruelty to legitimize his power grab, forcing the fragile Henry VI to sanction his appointment as protector of the realm again. Imagine the sheer, breathtaking audacity. The man who had just orchestrated the slaughter of the king's most trusted allies now claimed to be the king's protector, wearing the mantle of governance like a crown violently ripped from the head of the true sovereign. Londoners watched in horrified silence as the powerful Neville family, the formidable Earls of Salisbury and Warwick, soon to be known as the Kingmaker, consolidated their power around York, forming an impenetrable bulwark of white roses. The few years that followed St. Albans were a deceptive calm,
a horrifying pause where both sides simply rearmed, calculated the necessary cost of total victory, and plotted unimaginable betrayals. The court was not a sanctuary. It was a viper's nest, where every handshake was a potential stab, every decree a declaration of malice hidden under official seal.
We must pause here to discuss the true engine of fate, the game changer whose ambition would define the next decade of bloodshed. Richard Neville, the colossal Earl of Warwick. They called him the Kingmaker, and the title was utterly earned. He commanded unimaginable wealth, thousands of private retainers, and possessed a political cunning that made the established peers look like simpletons. Warwick was not fighting solely for York. He was fighting for himself, for the exhilarating, intoxicating thrill of controlling the destiny of England itself. His ambition was a black hole, constantly demanding more power, more influence, and ultimately more blood to solidify his position as the most powerful man in the realm.
Crucially, Warwick remained in London even when York went north, systematically cementing his control over the crucial, supremely valuable port of Calais. Calais was not just a fortress, it was the treasury, the key to English military power, funded by the lucrative wool trade, and its garrison was fiercely loyal to Warwick alone.
This meant that when the great conflict inevitably flared up again, Warwick could unleash a fully trained, battle-hardened army that neither the king nor the queen in their current state could effectively match. He held the wild card, the decisive force capable of tipping the scales of dynastic war. While York played the political puppet master in the frightened South, Queen Margaret was busy forging an alliance of unprecedented ferocity in the remote north. She retreated to the safety of her powerful castles, rallying every disgruntled peer, every loyal lord who had lost kin at St. Albans, and the unforgiving, often wild nobility of Scotland and Wales. She leveraged the very name of the king, though Henry was incapable, to sanctify her righteous campaign of revenge. The queen was an administrator, a general, and a diplomat rolled into one terrifying package, relentlessly preparing her inevitable, destructive counterattack. Every loyal Lancastrian knew that Richard of York's renewed protectorate was nothing more than a ticking time bomb. It was a temporary, illegal usurpation that blasphemed the divine right of Henry VI and insulted the entire lineage of the Red Rose. The Lancastrian cause was not wilted. It was merely gathering the dark, necessary rain required to grow into a monstrous, all-consuming vine of vengeance. The political maneuvering of the White Rose would be met, eventually, not by diplomacy, but by pure, unadulterated battlefield savagery. The fragile facade of peace finally cracked wide open in the year 1459. York's attempts to rule legitimately failed spectacularly. His arrogance alienated crucial moderate nobles, and Queen Margaret's propaganda machine worked tirelessly, labeling York not merely a protector, but a traitor, aiming explicitly for the sacred throne itself. The tensions erupted into violent skirmishes, local feuds igniting across the Midlands, culminating in the first true test of the renewed conflict, the pivotal Battle of Blore Heath. This was no quick, messy raid like St. Albans. This was a calculated, pitched engagement designed to eliminate the opposition's field commanders. The Lancastrians, led by the formidable Lord Audley, attempted to intercept a massive White Rose reinforcement column led by the Earl of Salisbury. The resulting bloodshed was immense, shocking the nation back into the grim reality of total civil war.
Salisbury's smaller, disciplined force crushed the larger Lancastrian army through brilliant strategic use of terrain and sheer Yorkist discipline. Lord Audley himself fell, killed in single combat, a heroic, tragic figure sacrificed on the altar of dynastic ambition. The Red Rose had tasted defeat again, but this time the stakes were impossibly higher.
There was absolutely no turning back now. The gears of total war had engaged, grinding the very soul of England into dust. The victory at Blore Heath momentarily emboldened York and Warwick, leading them to believe the moment of total domination was finally at hand.
They marched with overwhelming force, but Margaret was ready, forcing the Yorkist leaders into a humiliating, rapid retreat at the confrontation known to history as the Rout of Ludford Bridge. Facing superior numbers and the sudden defection of some key allies, York, Salisbury, and the Kingmaker were forced to flee England entirely, scattering across Europe like terrified prey.
York fled to Ireland, his ancient, untouchable stronghold, while Warwick sailed for the critical safety of Calais. Queen Margaret, now holding absolute, unchallengeable power, seized the opportunity for terminal political vengeance. She summoned a parliament in Coventry, a tribunal so severe and utterly ruthless in its judgments that history remembers it only as the Parliament of Devils. This wasn't governance, it was judicial annihilation, designed to erase the enemy from existence. The entire Yorkist faction, the dukes, the earls, their families, were stripped of their titles, their immense lands, their wealth, and declared irredeemable traitors, condemned to agonizing death upon capture. Margaret had chosen the ultimate path of extinction. By signing the death warrant for any hope of compromise, Queen Margaret ensured that the next time the White Rose returned, it would be with the desperate, merciless fury of men fighting not just for power, but for their very survival. The Red Rose had momentarily triumphed, but by sowing the seeds of such absolute hatred and dispossession, Margaret guaranteed that the next chapter would be a struggle for existence, where mercy was a forgotten word, and the only objective was the utter, final annihilation of the enemy bloodline. The stage was set for the Kingmaker's terrifying return. The stench of the first battle of St. Albans lingered not just in the air, thick with sulfur and noble blood, but in the halls of power, contaminating every decision made thereafter. Richard, Duke of York, had won a catastrophic victory, eliminating his chief rival, the Duke of Somerset, and capturing the king. But capturing Henry VI was not the same as securing the crown. The frail, psychologically shattered monarch was nothing more than the ultimate political hostage, a living shield against immediate retaliation. York immediately knelt before his captive cousin in a sickening display of feigned loyalty, declaring that he had only come to rescue the king from the wicked, traitorous advice of the Lancastrian councillors. This performance was mandatory. No one in 15th century England could openly admit to seizing the king by force without inviting total destruction. The narrative had to be one of reluctant protection, not brazen usurpation. Yet the political reality was stark and brutal. York was the master, and the anointed King of England was being marched back to London under the strict, watchful gaze of the White Rose soldiers. The true force behind this terrifying shift was not York's claim, but the relentless military genius of Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, the man who would soon earn the moniker that echoed dread across Europe, the Kingmaker. Warwick had tasted the intoxicating elixir of ultimate command at St. Albans, realizing that in this new age of political anarchy, mastery lay not with birthright, but with the ability to raise, equip, and deploy overwhelming force. The moment they entered London, the city was transformed into a Yorkist fortress. The subsequent Parliament was so steeped in fear that it became known as the Parliament of Bats, because so many fearful attendees, stripped of their swords by order of the Yorkists, carried staves, cudgels, and bludgeons instead. Within this environment of naked intimidation, York forced himself back into the position of protector of the realm, but the stability they craved remained hopelessly out of reach. For the men killed at St. Albans were not just political rivals. They were sons, brothers, and fathers to the most powerful noble houses in the country, and their widows and heirs were now demanding a vengeance that would consume the kingdom whole. But the fragile peace established by York's triumph was an absolute lie, because the one person who mattered most, the one person with the true fire of dynastic fury, was still free and gathering strength in the hostile, loyalist north. Queen Margaret of Anjou watched in white-hot rage as her husband was humiliated and her son's inheritance, Prince Edward, was actively undermined by the very man who sought the throne. Margaret was the steel Henry VI lacked. She refused to recognize any of the acts passed by York's protectorate, viewing him and Warwick not as legitimate rulers, but as treasonous pirates who had hijacked the ship of state. Her court became the epicenter of Lancastrian resistance, a gathering place for the vengeful northern lords who despised the Neville family and demanded justice for the spilled blood of Somerset and Clifford. For 4 years, England existed in a nightmarish political limbo, a suspended sentence where war was inevitable, but nobody dared fire the next shot. York struggled desperately to stabilize the crown's finances, but every decision he made was viewed through the lens of suspicion and self-interest by his enemies. Meanwhile, Warwick made a move of audacious military genius that cemented his terrifying future. He seized the captaincy of Calais. Calais was not merely a port, it was the most important military garrison outside of England, a vital trading post that provided independent revenue, immense patronage, and a corps of veteran soldiers loyal only to him. Warwick was building his own private military empire, funded by customs duties and manned by hardened mercenaries, completely outside the control of the crown he supposedly served. This action was a flashing red light for Margaret. The Kingmaker was preparing for the next, deeper war. The geography of the conflict hardened. The south and east, dominated by the Nevilles and York, favored the White Rose. The north and west, controlled by the Percy, Clifford, and Somerset families, remained fiercely loyal to the Red Rose of Lancaster. The propaganda war was relentless. York published manifestos painting himself as the selfless reformer, the only man capable of saving England from the chaos unleashed by Henry's mental incapacity and Margaret's foreign influence. Margaret, conversely, portrayed York as the naked usurper, a man whose ambition would destroy the sacred line of succession and plunge the kingdom into eternal sin. This was no longer just a feud. It was becoming an ideological struggle for the very soul of the English monarchy. The greatest piece of political theater designed to mask this festering hatred was the notorious Love Day in 1458. This elaborate procession was staged to convince the populace that the deadly foes had reconciled. Yorkist leaders walked hand in hand with the sons of the very men they had murdered at St. Albans, parading through London to St. Paul's Cathedral in a grotesque, forced show of amity. Warwick, the Kingmaker, walked beside the young Duke of Somerset, whose father he had helped butcher 3 years prior. The hypocrisy was so thick it was suffocating. Everyone knew it was a farce, a hollow truce secured by fear, not forgiveness. The blood debt was too immense to be erased by a mere procession. Margaret, who never truly trusted the truce, used this period of uneasy quiet to methodically organize her forces, raising loans and demanding fealty from the loyal lords of the Palatinate. She knew that as long as York and Warwick controlled the mechanism of government through the captive king, she had no voice. The only recourse was the sword. The peace was over before it began. The year was 1459, and Margaret, the Iron Queen, was ready to unleash the storm of Blore Heath, the battle that would finally rip the final, fragile veneer of civility from England and plunge the nation into the second, more brutal chapter of the dynastic annihilation. The wind howled across the Irish Sea, a fitting symphony for the shattered ambitions of the House of York. Richard, the Duke, had been forced into humiliating exile in Dublin, licking the wounds of Ludford Bridge, while the Queen, Margaret of Anjou, tasted the bitter sweetness of temporary, fragile victory. She had outlawed the Yorkist leaders, seized their lands, and declared them traitors to the crown, believing she had finally clipped the wings of the White Rose forever. She was wrong. She had forgotten one crucial, terrifying element that did not flee to Ireland. Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, the legendary kingmaker, who held the keys to England's future in the impenetrable fortress of Calais. Calais, the jewel of the English continental holdings, was not just a port. It was the ultimate, unsinkable staging ground, funded by the very trade revenues Warwick now commanded with absolute authority. While York stewed in foreign soil, Warwick was marshalling ships, gathering supplies, and, more dangerously, refining the weapon he wielded better than any sword, the narrative. This was not a war against the king, he preached to the masses and the merchants of London, but a holy crusade against the Duke of Somerset and the cabal of poisonous counselors who held poor, witless King Henry VI captive. He painted Margaret not as a devoted queen, but as a foreign viper controlling the levers of government, starving the common man while enriching her favorites. The propaganda machine roared to life, a medieval media blitz that prepared the soil for invasion even before the first ship left the harbor. The moment came in July 1460. Warwick, accompanied by Salisbury and the exiled leaders, crossed the Channel with a ruthless efficiency that stunned the Lancastrian court. They didn't sneak. They landed openly at Sandwich and immediately began the march toward the capital, greeted by cheers and open arms from the Kentish men who loathed Margaret's taxation and rule. London, the beating heart of English commerce and historically sympathetic to the Yorkist cause, threw open its gates without a fight. The speed of the maneuver was breathtaking. Within days, Warwick had secured the capital, forcing the Lancastrian army, led by the steadfast Duke of Buckingham and the mighty Earl of Shrewsbury, to scramble north to mobilize their forces. The desperate Lancastrians, dragging the deeply reluctant and increasingly catatonic King Henry VI along with them, managed to establish a defensive position near the town of Northampton. Their position was formidable, positioned behind the River Nene, fortified with a deep, deadly trench and jagged palisades designed to shatter any frontal assault. Buckingham felt secure. They had the terrain, the numbers, and critically, the symbol of the crown. But Warwick had something far more powerful than trenches or palisades, the dagger of treachery, sharpened and ready to plunge into the back of the Lancastrian defense. Before the battle could even begin, Warwick initiated negotiations, sending repeated messages to Henry VI requesting an audience, hoping to leverage the king's known desire for peace. When Buckingham, acting on Margaret's rigid orders, refused every overture, declaring that the earls would not be trusted, Warwick's cold response was recorded for history. "At 2 o'clock, I will speak with the king, or I will die." The clock ticked toward catastrophe. The sky opened up, releasing a torrential downpour that drenched the battlefield, rendering the primitive gunpowder weapons useless and turning the defensive trenches into muddy quagmires. It was precisely at the moment of the Yorkist charge that the true horror of betrayal unfolded. Humphrey, Lord Grey of Ruthin, commanded the key sector of the Lancastrian line, holding a crucial section of the palisade. Grey was not a loyal soldier, but a viper who had been secretly corresponding with the Yorkists, his loyalty purchased with promises of wealth and power. As the Yorkist forces approached his position, instead of raising his banner in defense, Lord Grey of Ruthin ordered his troops to stand down and, in the ultimate act of dynastic treason, tore down his own palisades, creating a gaping, fatal hole in the Lancastrian defenses. It was not a battle. It was a sudden, sickening massacre. The Yorkist forces flooded through the breach like a vengeful tidal wave, directly into the heart of the unsuspecting Lancastrian command structure. The Duke of Buckingham, realizing the horrific extent of the betrayal, fought with a doomed fury, only to be cut down on the spot, alongside the Earl of Shrewsbury and Viscount Beaumont. The Lancastrian leadership evaporated in a bloody, violent instant. The battle lasted barely 30 minutes. The rest of the Lancastrian army, seeing their commanders dead and the king's standard falter, broke and scattered, leaving the field littered with thousands of corpses. The prize, the ultimate trophy of this sickening internecine conflict, was found exactly where Warwick expected him to be. King Henry VI, seated passively in his royal tent, reportedly humming softly to himself, detached entirely from the slaughter that had just occurred outside. The king was once again a prisoner, a puppet dressed in silk and velvet, firmly in the hands of the kingmaker. Warwick had achieved the impossible. He had conquered the king and England in a single, audacious stroke of military brilliance and calculated treason. But the true tremor, the one that would shake the foundations of the entire realm, was yet to come. With the king secured and Parliament summoned, Richard of York, having sailed back from Ireland, marched into Westminster, not as a humble servant, but with the terrifying ambition of a conqueror. He strode directly to the empty, sacred throne, placed his hand upon it, and then, in a silence that echoed like thunder throughout the hall, he sat down, staking his ultimate claim not just to the protection of the realm, but to the crown itself, setting the stage for the catastrophic confrontation known as the Act of Accord. The parchment was signed, the wax melted and stamped. But the Act of Accord was not a treaty of peace. It was the loudest declaration of war ever etched into English law. Richard of York, now officially anointed as the successor to the feeble Henry VI, had essentially declared that Queen Margaret's bloodline was worthless, a fatal error in judgment that would echo like a death knell across the frozen fields of winter. The Queen, the she-wolf of France, was not merely offended. She was incandescent with a vengeful rage that threatened to melt the London snows. To disinherit her sacred son, Prince Edward, the rightful heir born of her royal body, and replace him with that grasping cousin, York. Unthinkable, intolerable. This was not a negotiation. This was a sentence of annihilation, and she accepted the challenge with chilling alacrity. While York settled into the false comfort of his newly confirmed power in London, believing the law would hold back a queen consumed by righteous fury, Margaret was already riding. She sped toward the deep, unforgiving north, the traditional bastion of Lancastrian loyalty, assembling a coalition of the most hardened, battle-tested barons England possessed. The Lords Clifford, Neville of Westmoreland line, and Percy gathered their banners, swearing oaths of loyalty not to the crown, symbolized by the puppet King Henry, but to the promise of her son and the complete destruction of the White Rose. They didn't care about legal maneuvers or parliamentary decrees. They only understood the language of steel and blood, and Margaret was promising a feast of both. Richard, Duke of York, made the fatal strategic blunder that defines this chapter of the war. He calculated that with the king nominally on his side and Parliament satisfied, the Queen's northern resistance would be a minor policing action, a simple skirmish to quell before Christmas.
He ignored the chilling reports of massive levies gathering near Pontefract, and instead, with the self-assurance of a man who believes himself infallible, he marched north to enforce his new legal authority. He took his most trusted son, the young but equally ambitious Edmund, Earl of Rutland, and a relatively small force, believing his name and title would suffice to scatter the ragged rebels.
By December, the chill was absolute, biting deep into the marrow of the soldiers, and York found himself trapped not by law, but by logistics. He took refuge in Sandal Castle near Wakefield, a strong defensive position, but he was dangerously exposed, far from his main supply lines, and crucially, far outnumbered by the Lancastrian surge. Margaret's army, fueled by winter grit and the promise of plunder, was immense, an avalanche of red roses descending from the hills. They arrived outside Sandal, surrounding the small, arrogant Yorkist contingent, effectively besieging the man who thought he held all the power. For weeks, the standoff simmered beneath the freezing fog. York had supplies, he had thick walls, he could have waited for reinforcements from his sons, Edward and George. But the Duke of York was not a man built for patient defense. He was a lion who hated being caged, and the taunts hurled over the castle walls by Margaret's men began to grate on his legendary pride. They called him pretender and traitor, questioning his courage, a psychological warfare tactic perfected by the ruthless northern lords who understood the fragility of a proud man's ego better than any scholar. Then came the ultimate bait. Reports whispered through the cold wind that a mere foraging party, a weak detachment of the enemy, was ripe for the picking just outside the fortress gates. A chance for a quick, morale-boosting victory. On December 30th, 1460, Richard, blinded by pride and misled by deliberate deception, ordered his gates opened. He led his small army, numbering perhaps only 1,500 men, out onto the treacherous fields beneath Sandal Castle, intent on punishing the supposed foraging force and scattering the rest of the Lancastrian rabble, not realizing he was riding straight into a perfectly executed military trap. Lord Clifford and the Earl of Wiltshire had concealed the true bulk of Margaret's army in the surrounding woods and valleys, utilizing the undulating terrain and thick winter mists to mask the overwhelming numbers they possessed, estimated at 4 times York's strength. The moment York's forces were fully committed, engaged with the initial skirmish line, the 2 hidden flanks swept in, slamming into the exposed Yorkist troops from the sides, turning the field into a blood-soaked abattoir. The ensuing Battle of Wakefield was not a battle. It was a massacre. A swift, brutal execution designed to send the clearest possible message back to London. Challenge the Queen, challenge the Prince, and this is your reward. The Yorkist forces were utterly overwhelmed, their lines shattered, their defense collapsing almost instantly under the weight of the Lancastrian onslaught. Richard of York fought with the desperate fury of a cornered beast, attempting a desperate retreat back toward the castle gates, but the sheer volume of his enemies was too much. His second son, the 17-year-old Edmund, Earl of Rutland, a boy barely old enough to command, was pulled from the panicked retreat. Rutland was spotted fleeing, his young face pale with terror, when he was intercepted by the most ferocious of Margaret's commanders, Lord Clifford, whose own father had been cut down by York. Clifford was a man consumed by the ancient demand for an eye justice, and seeing the son of his enemy before him, he felt no pity, no mercy, only the cold, sharp need for vengeance for his own fallen line. The young prince pleaded, reportedly kneeling at Clifford's feet, begging for his life, crying out that he was merely a boy and not a threat to the Queen or her cause. But the words fell upon ears deafened by bloodlust. Clifford famously declared, his voice ringing across the dying field, "Your father slew mine, and I will slay thee and all thy kin," before plunging his knife into the heart of the boy, executing him with chilling impunity. Richard of York himself was captured moments later, dragged from the field, stripped of his armor, and subjected to the ultimate humiliation before being summarily executed. The Lancastrians placed a paper crown mockingly upon his head, shouting, "Hail, King!" before beheading the Duke whose ambitions had torn England apart. The red rose had finally drawn blood from the root of the white rose. The message was delivered not only in steel, but in sickening symbolism. York's head, along with the head of his young son Rutland, and the head of his brother-in-law Salisbury, were impaled on stakes and displayed publicly above the gates of York, facing south toward the capital, carrying the most gruesome trophy of war England had ever witnessed, demanding entry and the final reckoning for the Act of Accord. The cold winds of February whipped through the city of York, freezing the horrific grin onto the face of Richard Plantagenet. His head, crowned with a mocking paper crown, was the ultimate trophy, a symbol of Margaret's savage triumph at Wakefield, a spectacle of ultimate, terrifying revenge that was meant to crush the spirit of the entire Yorkist cause. But the Queen knew that a severed head only cleared the battlefield temporarily. It never truly silenced the war drum. The white rose had been cut down, but its roots ran deep into the heart of a vengeful son, Edward, the towering, battle-hardened Earl of March, who now swore vengeance that would make his father's ambitions look like mere parlor games. Margaret had secured the captive king, the feeble Henry VI, but London, the very treasury and beating heart of England, was held firmly in the iron grip of her nemesis, the mighty Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker. Her path south was laid out in blood, a terrifying campaign of retribution and necessary survival. She unleashed the northern host. This was not a disciplined royal army marching under banners of law and order. This was a whirlwind of border lords, rugged northerners, and desperate men promised the spoils of war once they crossed the River Trent. Their advance was not a march, but a calculated terror campaign, looting, pillaging, and burning their way through the wealthy Yorkist-leaning Midlands, shattering any illusion of royal protection in the south. They were the scythe of the Lancastrian cause, cutting down everything in their path. The horror stories preceding them, of ransoms demanded, churches defiled, and brutal, arbitrary executions, were enough to make entire villages flee into the frozen forests, abandoning their homes and livelihoods to the inevitable destruction. Margaret, blinded by rage and necessity, made a fatal choice. She allowed this wanton destruction, believing that fear was a tool as sharp as any sword to subdue the South. Every town burned, every wealthy merchant ruined, cemented the South's hatred for the Queen and confirmed the Yorkist propaganda. Margaret was a foreign tyrant leading barbarians into the heart of civilized England. While the North burned, the Kingmaker, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, scrambled to consolidate his position in London. He still had the prize, Henry VI himself, a passive, preying pawn in the largest game of chess England had ever played, safely locked away in the capital. Warwick's strategy was simple, even desperate: defend the capital, secure the king, and wait for young Edward to arrive with his battle-tested reinforcements from the Welsh marches. He marched out of London with a formidable but hastily assembled force, placing his defenses near the ancient market town of St. Albans, the site of their previous, smaller victory 6 years earlier. He believed his position was impregnable, utilizing hedges, ditches, and the narrow lanes to funnel the northern savagery into a meat grinder, securing the main route to London. Warwick felt the weight of England on his shoulders, positioning himself not just as a nobleman defending his king, but as a defender of civilization itself against what he perceived as the chaotic fury of the Queen's lawless mercenaries. The fate of the capital hung on his skill. The confrontation was brutal, fought in the deep snow and icy mud of February 17th, 1461. Warwick, confident in his deployment, made one catastrophic oversight that would haunt him for the rest of his legendary life: misplaced trust. He relied heavily on the loyalty of the Kentish troops forming a critical part of his line, particularly the contingent led by Sir Robert Lovelace. As the fighting raged, the Lancastrian forces launched a fierce flanking maneuver. Suddenly, and without warning, Lovelace, either through outright treachery, opportunism, or pure pre-planned betrayal, abandoned his post entirely, pulling his men back and exposing Warwick's flank to a crushing Lancastrian assault led by the Duke of Somerset. The Yorkist line shattered instantly beneath the weight of this exposed vulnerability. The battle turned into a terrifying rout, far more devastating than the clash at Wakefield. The well-ordered Southern troops, unused to the relentless, disorganized ferocity of the Northern host, were swept away like autumn leaves in a hurricane of steel and vengeance. Warwick, realizing the catastrophic nature of the betrayal and the battle's loss, fled, abandoning his banners and his position. But he could not flee fast enough to save his ultimate prize, the king who had been his puppet for so long. In the chaos of the Yorkist collapse, Margaret's forces stormed the royal pavilion. They found Henry VI sitting calmly, reciting prayers, entirely oblivious to the bloodbath raging around him, detached from the reality of his own precarious existence. He was rescued, or rather forcibly reclaimed, by his triumphant queen and their son, Prince Edward, who watched the proceedings with the cold eyes of a boy already being groomed for the violence of kingship. The Lancastrians exacted immediate, terrible vengeance for Henry's captivity. The hapless Yorkist guards who had been keeping the king captive were dragged out and executed on the spot, in a display designed to terrify any future betrayers. Among the victims was the elderly and respected Lord Bonville, whose final, desperate prayers went unanswered. Margaret watched, perhaps even approved, as the final chains of her hated rivals were broken in a spectacle of gore and triumph. Margaret of Anjou had achieved what she had prayed for. The king was free, the kingmaker was routed, and the path to London was open, seemingly cleared for the restoration of Lancastrian power. The news hit London like a tremor, shattering the city's complacent sense of security. The kingmaker had lost, defeated by the Queen's terrifying army. The northern host, the plundering force whose reputation for savagery had preceded it across the entire breadth of England, was now mere miles away, separated only by the undefended gates of the capital city. Panic erupted. Wealthy merchants barricaded their doors, prepared for slaughter and plunder on a scale never before imagined. Margaret paused. This was the moment of absolute victory, yet she hesitated at the threshold. Why? The northern host was dangerously uncontrollable. If she led them into London, they would sack the richest city in Europe, alienating forever the powerful merchants and administrators whose gold and loyalty she desperately needed to stabilize Henry's fragile throne. She demanded supplies and money from the terrified Londoners, but refused to guarantee the safety of their city from her own monstrous army. This was a fatal strategic error, born of desperation, and the Queen's inability to control the engine of war she had unleashed. London, fearing the rapacious North far more than the disciplined threat of the Yorkists, slammed its gates shut and prepared for siege, denying the Queen access to her own capital. Every hour Margaret stalled outside the walls, agonizing over her next move, was an hour of life granted to her most terrifying enemy, young Edward, now marching from the west. While Margaret debated the ethics of unleashing a horde on 1,000,000 souls, the true power of the White Rose was moving swiftly, converging on the capital. Edward, the massive 18-year-old Earl of March, had just annihilated a separate Lancastrian force at Mortimer's Cross in a display of tactical brilliance and pure, raw charisma that stunned England. He was everything his father had been, but faster, younger, and driven by a furnace of revenge for the heads mounted on York's gate. He marched directly toward London, not knowing Margaret was stalling just north of the city. Warwick, having fled St. Albans, executed a brilliant strategic maneuver. Rather than chase the Lancastrians, he swung westward and linked up with Edward's victorious army. The two most formidable figures of the Yorkist cause were now united, an unstoppable wave crashing toward the capital. Margaret's temporary victory at St. Albans had just become her permanent ruin. She had gained a king, but she had lost the capital's support, and in doing so, she had birthed a new, dynamic, and terrifying Yorkist king, ready to claim the crown by right of conquest and blood. The stage was set for the bloodiest day in English history. The frozen mud of the battlefield was not merely stained red. It was caked in the thick, unforgiving crimson of the thousands who had fallen for a failing dynasty. The wind, whipping across the northern plains, carried not just the scent of snow, but the metallic tang of fresh death, a gruesome perfume announcing the end of one era and the violent beginning of another, consecrated in the slaughter known only as the bloodiest day. King Henry VI, the spectral shadow of a monarch, had been irrevocably shattered, his forces annihilated, his reign broken beyond repair. He was no longer the King of England. He was a terrified fugitive, dragged from the carnage by the desperate remnants of his dwindling loyalists, retreating towards the last vestiges of Lancastrian power in the wild, untamed north. His madness once a private affliction, was now a national catastrophe, leaving the door wide open for the ferocious new power emerging from the White Rose. Edward, Earl of March, now proclaimed King Edward IV, rode into London not as a supplicant begging for recognition, but as a conqueror, bathed in the glory of absolute, terrifying victory. He was everything Henry was not. Tall, overwhelmingly charismatic, strategically brilliant, and possessing a terrifying certainty in his own divine right to rule, a right he had just seized with a long sword, forged in the blood of his enemies.
His entry into the capital was a meticulously orchestrated spectacle designed to awe and intimidate the skeptical populace. The streets, which had recently whispered sedition against Henry and the failing Lancastrian cause, now erupted in manufactured celebration for this magnificent 20-year-old titan. But Edward's immediate focus was not the cheap thrill of popular acclaim. It was the brutal necessity of consolidation and merciless vengeance.
He knew that a crown won through bloodshed required continuous, unforgiving vigilance. And the ghosts of the Red Rose still breathed, led by the most dangerous woman in all of Christendom, Queen Margaret of Anjou. He understood that legitimacy was not granted by Parliament or tradition, but carved out with the edge of the sword, and he intended to keep carving until every last doubter was silenced, either by allegiance or execution. Margaret, the legendary she-wolf, had tasted devastating defeat, but she had not swallowed it. Her heart was a blazing forge of vengeful fury, and she clung desperately to her young son, Prince Edward, the last legitimate hope of the tattered Lancastrian line, viewing him as the sacred vessel of future restoration. She retreated with frantic speed to Scotland, where she leveraged ancient grudges and offered up priceless border towns and vital strategic territories to the Scottish king in exchange for the mercenaries she desperately needed to reclaim her husband's throne. This was an act of high treason, an unforgivable act of national surrender. Yet for Margaret, the crown outweighed the kingdom, and patriotism was secondary to dynastic survival. The North became her temporary fortress, a hostile, unforgiving land where Yorkist power struggled violently to take root. The war was morphing rapidly from massive, decisive pitched battles into a brutal, attritional guerrilla campaign, a constant low-level drain of men and resources that threatened to bleed Edward's nascent reign dry before his coronation jewels were even properly polished. The coronation of Edward IV was held in Westminster Abbey, a majestic masterpiece of pageantry, deliberately masking the sheer, raw violence of the political coup that had just occurred. The gold, the jewels, the solemn oaths, all were painstakingly designed to legitimize a usurpation, transforming the rebel into the divine king. But everyone present knew the horrifying, unspoken truth. This new, glorious king owed his throne, his life, and his entire future to one man whose shadow darkened the halls of power. Richard Neville, the supremely wealthy, devastatingly powerful Earl of Warwick, the infamous Kingmaker. Warwick was the shadow behind the throne, the master tactician and architect of Edward's victory, controlling armies, diplomacy, and the national purse strings with an iron grip. Edward was the dazzling figurehead, the youthful, charismatic mask of authority. Warwick was the relentless, indispensable engine of state. This symbiotic relationship, however, was immediately recognized by the court as a ticking political time bomb. The kingmaker had elevated a king. He also possessed the lethal, intimate knowledge of exactly how to tear one down. And Edward, young and arrogant, chafed violently under the crushing weight of obligation. Edward was a lion, ready to roar, yet Warwick treated him, subtly but consistently, like a highly valuable, well-bred, but ultimately leashed pet. The tension between the glorious king and his immensely powerful, indispensable subject began to crackle like distant lightning across the political landscape, a chilling promise of the civil war that would eventually break out within the very heart of the triumphant Yorkist camp itself. Edward IV wasted absolutely no time in executing the remaining Lancastrian leaders captured after the devastating defeat, including the Earls of Wiltshire and Northumberland. Treason was punished with swift, merciless beheadings, a clear, unambiguous message that the days of Henry's weak, pious pardons were over forever. This was a government built on cold, hard steel and swift, certain reprisal. Meanwhile, the hunt for the fugitive Henry VI became an obsessive priority for the new regime. As long as the former king lived, even in profound madness, he remained a dangerously potent rallying point for every disaffected lord and every remaining Lancastrian loyalist hiding in the shadows. Henry, reduced to pathetic rags and shuffling across the wild northern moors, was sometimes recognized and sometimes aided by deeply religious commoners who still viewed him, despite his utter incapacity, as God's anointed sovereign. His life was a miserable, desperate flight, a cruel irony for a man who had once worn the crown of France and England. He was eventually captured, not in a grand siege or noble battle, but betrayed by a local landowner near Waddington Hall, dragged south in the deepest humiliation, and brought back to London to face his fate. Picture the devastating scene. Henry VI, the former ruler of half of Europe, dressed in threadbare blue velvet, riding backward on a small pony through the streets of London, mocked, jeered, and insulted by the very people who had once cheered his name. He was locked away in the Tower of London, held captive by the son of the man he had once imprisoned and then foolishly spared, Richard of York. Edward IV had secured his ultimate prize. The white rose was seemingly triumphant, the red rose violently crushed. Their anointed leader locked away in an inescapable stone cage. But Margaret still breathed fire in Scotland. The symbol of the rightful succession still existed, and the kingmaker's ambition still grew, silently twisting like a hungry vine in the dark heart of the court. The most dangerous phase of the War of the Roses was about to begin. The phase where allies turn into enemies, and the victor realizes that victory is merely a temporary, fragile reprieve from inevitable betrayal. The cycle of blood had not ended. It had merely paused for a single dramatic breath. The temporary reprieve had ended. The fragile truce, built on the shifting sands of Henry VI's fleeting sanity, dissolved like smoke in a gale. Richard of York, having tasted the sweet poison of power during his brief protectorate, found himself constantly fighting the ghost of Queen Margaret, a ghost far more dangerous than the living, weak king he held captive. The Queen had retreated north, not in defeat, but in a calculated, strategic withdrawal, transforming the remote castles of the realm into laboratories of retribution. She tirelessly gathered the scattered, loyal Lancastrian lords, whispering promises of vengeance and restoration into the ears of every powerful man who felt slighted by the burgeoning power of the White Rose faction. This was no longer just a dynastic quarrel over a crown. Margaret successfully framed it as a brutal war of regional identity, pitting the fiercely loyal northern counties against the calculating, ambitious nobility of the South. She leveraged the deep historical resentment held by the ancient houses, convincing them that the Yorkist triumph meant their ultimate subjugation to the overmighty Earls of Warwick and Salisbury. The Red Rose, though severely pruned by the sword at St. Albans, began to send out new, dangerous shoots, roots soaking deep into the fertile soil of fear and regional pride, awaiting the signal to bloom once more in blood. York, meanwhile, struggled to govern a kingdom that viewed him with profound suspicion. His attempts at political reform and administrative stability were continuously sabotaged by the silent, omnipresent network of Margaret's spies and loyalists embedded deep within the court structure. The true power still resided in the principle of the king, even if the king himself was a political nullity, and Margaret understood this distinction perfectly. She decided that simply sidelining the Yorkists was insufficient. They must be annihilated, legislatively and physically. This dark resolve culminated in the infamous Assembly of 1459, held far from the Yorkist stronghold of London, in the staunchly Lancastrian city of Coventry, a parliament that would be forever remembered with a shudder, the Parliament of Devils. It was a legislative ambush of unparalleled cruelty, meticulously orchestrated by Margaret to destroy the House of York and its allies, root and branch. The acts of attainder passed during that terrifying session were not just legal documents stripping men of their titles and lands. They were death warrants signed in ink, condemning Richard of York, Salisbury, and the mighty Earl of Warwick as high traitors to the crown, with the forfeiture extending to their heirs forever. This single, decisive political stroke instantly transformed the leading men of the White Rose into hunted fugitives, their vast estates seized, their authority dissolved. They were forced into a desperate, humiliating flight. York himself sought refuge in his great power base of Ireland, a perilous distance from the Queen's vengeful grasp. Salisbury, alongside his son, the formidable Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the man history would call the Kingmaker,
made a daring escape across the Channel to the strategic bastion of Calais.
Calais was more than just a port. It was the last English foothold in France, an independently funded, highly militarized fortress whose control instantly conferred immense strategic power. Margaret, in her triumphant haste at Coventry, had committed a fatal error. She had signed the Kingmaker's exile, but failed to capture him, leaving the most skilled, ruthless military leader in England in control of the most powerful overseas military base. Warwick, burning with righteous fury and the sting of humiliation, immediately transformed Calais into the operational command center for the counter-rebellion. He leveraged the garrison's immense resources and transformed his ships into instruments of cunning piracy, seizing Lancastrian-aligned vessels and turning the spoils of war into gold for the White Rose war chest, fueling the machine of inevitable return. The Yorkist leaders planned a massive, coordinated invasion for the summer of 1459, a three-pronged thrust designed to overwhelm the increasingly confident Lancastrian forces. Salisbury, attempting to link up with York's forces, found his path blocked near Market Drayton by a massive royal army under the command of Lord Audley, who promised Margaret he would deliver the Yorkist traitor to her, bound in chains. The resulting confrontation at Blore Heath was a stunning testament to Salisbury's tactical genius. Vastly outnumbered, possibly 2-1, Salisbury deployed his archers and men-at-arms on a steep embankment, using a clever feigned retreat across a small river to bait the overconfident Lancastrians. Audley, blinded by the scent of easy victory and driven by Margaret's relentless demands for Yorkist blood, ordered a reckless, disordered charge across the treacherous ground. It was a catastrophic tactical mistake. The disciplined Yorkist line held firm against the scattered attack, and the ensuing slaughter was horrific. Lord Audley himself fell, and his army fractured and fled, delivering the first major military victory for the exiled Yorkists, and proving that Margaret's political maneuvers had not yet guaranteed military success. But the triumph was fleeting. The three Yorkist armies, Salisbury's successful but exhausted contingent, Warwick's fresh Calais veterans, and York's Irish forces, converged near Ludford Bridge, only to find the royal army waiting. Margaret's forces were massive, expertly entrenched, and crucially, led by the physical presence of King Henry VI himself, whose banner represented the full, unquestionable authority of the crown. The psychological impact was devastating. Faced with the immediate prospect of fighting the king in person rather than merely the Queen's faction, the Yorkist resolve fractured. Key segments of their army, particularly the Calais veterans, hesitated, and demoralization set in like a creeping disease, turning into outright desertion under the cover of the cold October night. It was a catastrophic collapse of nerve and command. Richard of York, Salisbury, and Warwick were forced into a humiliating midnight rout, abandoning their entire camp, their supplies, and, most cruelly, their families, to the mercy of the Queen's vengeful triumph. Margaret, arriving at the abandoned camp, was ecstatic, indulging in a moment of pure, devastating personal cruelty. she seized the Duchess of York and her young children, publicly proclaiming the humiliation of the traitors, ensuring the entire world knew the depth of the White Rose defeat. But in their desperate, scrambling flight, the Yorkist leaders had once again managed to evade the hangman's noose, scattering back to their distant strongholds in Ireland and Calais. The White Rose was bent, certainly, but not yet broken, and Margaret knew, deep in her victorious but uneasy soul, that she had merely delayed the inevitable, relentless plotting for their next bloody return.